Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us for this Center for the National Interest online panel discussion. I'm really excited here to have two of my Center for the National Interest colleagues, Nick Gvozdev and Jay Koo, each of whom have senior fellow roles at the center, to talk about the evolving Russia-North Korea relationship. Nick is a senior fellow at the center. He's also a professor at the Naval War College, has a variety of other things that he's been doing with the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs in New York. And for those with a really long memory, also many years ago, the editor of the center's magazine, The National Interest. Jay Koo, my colleague, our senior fellow, focused on U.S.-Korea relations, also with really a rich background, having created and led the U.S.-Korea Institute at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies for more than a decade. Also a background at Freedom House and doing a number of other really cool things like making historical documentaries more recently, and certainly very steeped in Korean peninsula affairs. So excited to have both of them with us today for this discussion. We'll go first to Nick, then to Jay, then we will open up for questions. So Nick, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Paul, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just as a note, everything I'm going to say in this webinar is my own personal opinion, doesn't reflect any position of the U.S. government or of any of the institutions with which I'm affiliated. First and foremost, and probably not as much for the group that we've assembled here, but I do think it's important to call out something that I've sensed in particularly the U.S. larger policy community and certainly in the media, and that is a tendency to still think about Russia and the DPRK, North Korea, in terms of stereotypes from the 1990s. So we think of Russia as this very backward, collapsed society. We think of North Korea in terms of the famines of the 1990s. And in some of my contacts and discussions with staff and people in the policy process, there can almost be a discounting. Well, who cares, right? North Korea really isn't that much of a factor in world affairs. Their things don't work. Russia is really a declining power. The meme that the Russians and now perhaps the North Koreans are using shovels in Ukraine. And it's dangerous. It's a dangerous start if we think about North Korea and Russia working together and intensification of that relationship over the last 3 years, and then assume, well, it doesn't really matter because these aren't really states with capabilities and they really can't affect either the Indo-Pacific or the Euro-Atlantic world that much. And so I just wanted to start with that warning not to this is not to say that Russia and the DPRK are 10 feet tall and unstoppable and that they can't be dealt with, but this lingering sense of contempt from the 1990s experiences is dangerous to the extent it influences our cognitive approach to when we hear the term, oh, North Koreans are doing something along the Russia-Ukraine border, if it's an outdated stereotype. So I did want to throw that out there as to frame our overarching conversation. We really need to accept what a sea change has occurred over the last several years. And I'm going to speak primarily obviously from the Russia side of the house, because I don't think it's fully appreciated the extent to which the Kremlin has reluctantly, in some cases, really jettisoned or accepted that aspects of Russian foreign policy since the 1990s are no longer feasible, and how North Korea then fits into that. And the first illusion, if we want to call it an illusion, is that the Kremlin no longer believes that it is possible to have a substantive partnership with the United States, or that integration with the West is on the agenda. Economic integration, technological integration, that Russia's future lies with the West, and particularly in a partnership with the United States, where the United States may be the senior partner, but where Russia still plays an important role. And keep in mind that in the 2000s and into the 2010s, the Russian approach to the DPRK was predicated to some extent on wanting to show that Russia could be useful, that it was a player along with the United States, was part of the six power talks, that it could play a role in helping to stabilize Northeast Asia. And now, to the extent that Russia no longer believes that partnership with the United States is on the agenda, the Russian view, therefore, is that Russia is not as invested in global and regional governance in the same ways. That the idea that Russia needed to be part of the six power talks, it needed to commit to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Russia may still formally hold those views and may still state them, but I think increasingly the sense is, look, North Korean nuclear program inhibits the United States. It's a problem for US allies, and therefore it's no longer, solving it is no longer of concern to Russia. Imposing sanctions on North Korea is no longer in Russia's interests. The second driver for this is that if partnership with the West is completely off, I think that the Russian government now accepts that its outreach to South Korea, to the Republic of Korea, and to Japan, which guided some of its approaches again in this 2000s into the 2010s. The idea that Japan, South Korea would counterbalance Chinese investment in Russia, that Russia would have new markets, particularly for energy in Russia and South Korea, and that downplaying its relationship with North Korea was part of its outreach to Seoul and to Tokyo. The Russians, in my view, and we can discuss this, I think were very much taken aback by the extent to which Tokyo and Seoul joined the sanctions regime against Russia after 2022, after the resumption of full-scale Russian military action in Ukraine. Their hope was that Japan and South Korea would adopt, well, this is a European problem and not really to do with us, and we're not going to take our relationship with Russia and sacrifice it, so to speak, for the sake of Ukraine. And so in that regard, therefore, also restraining North Korea is now less critical as a way to try to win support in Seoul and in Tokyo. And then finally, the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has produced new strains in Russia. It blocked off some of Russia's traditional export markets. So in the past, Russia would prefer to sell commodities and energy to people who could pay higher prices, but now it has some surpluses. It has increased labor needs, not just simply military, but if you're going to put the military-industrial complex on triple shifts, you need more laborers, more workers. North Korea has a surplus of labor. North Korea needs food and energy and other commodities, which Russia is now able and willing to provide. And so there's in a sense, there is almost a comparative advantage which drives the two together, which is that Russia benefits from excess surplus labor that North Korea can provide. The North Korean government gets a much more reliable supply of key commodities, which in turn helps it to boost its standing among the population if it's improving the living finally improving the living standards of North Koreans. North Koreans get opportunities. And so that there is this practical relationship that has joined, that has really fostered over the last 3 years, where the comparative advantages of both sides plays out. And so let me just then end with my last point, which is this kind of marriage of convenience that starts after 2022 is now morphing into what I think is a more substantive security and political relationship. The extent to which Russia seems to be trying to put together a grouping of the outcasts, or of people who are on the outs with the United States or with the US-led system, trying to integrate, work together. Foreign Minister Lavrov was just in the DPRK before heading to China, talking about the invincible fighting brotherhood between Russia and North Korea, and a sense that North Korean and Russian interests are beginning to align, both against the West, but also for both sides a bit of a hedge against China. North Korea may have, at least my read is that North Korea may have a bit of a stronger set of security guarantees now from Moscow than from Beijing. Moscow is always looking for alternatives to complete dependence on China, and to the extent that North Korea's military industrial complex can produce the mass quantities of things that are needed, because as we've seen in Ukraine, it's great to have a very technical, a wonderfully technologically exquisite system, but 50 dumb systems will take out one technologically exquisite system, and 155 millimeter shells, a lot of them can deliver impacts that a single drone or a single ATACMS can also deliver. So in that sense, having those supply relationships in place is useful to Russia. Not having to always rely on Russian manpower, both in the defense industrial complex, but also for troop usage is useful. As we've seen, there's reports Laos may also now be considering sending some people for using Russia as a training ground, and using this as an ability to get some funds back to Laos as well. And so it really, there's some trends that are beginning to develop that over time could then really begin to reshape both the security dynamics in the Far East as well as in Europe. And so with that, Paul, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. So Jay, your thoughts. And
Thank
then
you.
when Jay finishes, we'll open for questions.
Thank you, Nick. That's a great overview of what's happening. I think what's happening in North Korea largely mirrors what you said about Russia. And North Korea's participation in the Russia-Ukraine war is so fascinating because in so many levels, we know so little about North Korea's capability to fight a modern war, what it hopes to gain from Russia, what it's actually getting from Russia, and what implications there may be domestically for North Korea. And how will this bold adventurism by North Korea, really an unprecedented adventurism, have impact on its relations with its neighbors and the United States? So let me just give a little recap of what we think we know so far. I think many of the people who are on this webinar who cover Asia will know, but those of you who may cover other issues and may not be up to date, don't know that in the latter half of 2023, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, begins to send unknown quantities of weapons to Russia. The political discussion that started in July of 23 led to the signing of a new defense pact last year called the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. And to date, we think North Korea has sent over 100 ballistic missiles and as many as 12 million artillery rounds in almost 30,000 containers, with more to come. We think North Korea has sent 10,000, 12,000 soldiers. Ukrainian intelligence suggests that maybe 4,000 of them have been killed or wounded. And just last week, North Korea was reported to have committed another 6,000 military construction workers, military engineers to be sent to Kursk, Russia. And so what does North Korea get out of this? Well, obviously hard currency for much of its needs, and certainly technology. To what extent, we don't know. But Russia has said to have promised some $2,000 per soldier per month, totaling that would be for 10,000 soldiers, 20 million monthly. Some reports suggest that North Korea received close to $600 million, which would suggest that it's more than 10,000. Perhaps this is for more future commitment. And this is on top of what we think is a close to $5.5 billion in weapons transaction. Of course, almost none of this will be going to the soldiers and the family. But there will be perks for the soldiers, because their families will get better, perhaps housing, access to resources. And North Korea obviously gets much needed hard currency, refined petroleum, other grain products, whatever. In terms of technology, we think that North Korea will ask a lot of things, right? We assume that it's asking and receiving help for most missile development. Ukrainian intelligence has confirmed that Russian guidance system has been installed in Korean missiles, dramatically improving its accuracy. And North Korea needs a lot of technical expertise, not so much to build new weapon systems, but to refine existing ones. In their ballistic missile program, North Korea needs to improve heat shielding metallurgy technology for its reentry vehicles. It needs to improve its guidance and targeting systems. We think North Korea has not yet demonstrated its ability to miniaturize nuclear warheads, but this could be something that Russia could provide. And while North Korea launched its first solid fuel ICBM in 2023, they probably need more technology to improve consistency and reliability, and so forth. But aside from these transactional benefits, there are intangibles that give North Korea and Russia a value in this relationship. So I and others who run conferences on the US-ROK alliance, we would often start with this statement. This is an alliance forged in blood, where 37,000 Americans sacrificed their lives. I must have said this sentence dozens of times. But for North Korea, this hasn't been the case with Russia. Certainly the Chinese, and their relationship is described as akin to lips and teeth. But North Korea, as Nick said, often feels cornered by China. And many of my colleagues in South Korea tell me that North Korean elites really do not like the Chinese. They're seen as being arrogant, condescending, rapacious. That is not true with probably your average citizens who are probably connected to the black market economy with China, but certainly I think the North Korean elites do not like the Chinese elites. What can military collaboration and economic enlargement provide for North Korea? As Nick mentioned, I think that is true for North Korea. In the late 80s and 90s, we always thought there could be a breakthrough with North Korea with the United States. And that was whether it's through 4-party talks, 6-party talks, that North Korea wanted relationship with the US. Early 90s, we thought North Korea wanted a relationship with Japan, largely to get large economic aid for war reparations or the colonial era reparations. That seems to be less of an important issue, or if at all. North Korea now has, I think, basically destroyed all semblance of inter-Korean relations progress. All of everything from inter-Korean rail system to cultural centers. And this, I think, is really putting their eggs on a basket that tries to balance China with Russia. As Nick mentioned, the foreign minister, Russia's foreign minister was there last week, but so was the culture minister. And it coincides with North Korea um, opening a new resort. If you have time, Google Map the Wonsan Resort. It is pretty amazing. I mean, there's some YouTube videos out there, there are articles, and you see this 2.5 mile resort along the beach. It is pretty impressive. And so North Korea is obviously building these lavish resorts, whether it's ski resorts and beach resorts. And their, I think, approach is kind of, if you build it, they will come, but they really do need to reach out to get the Russians, maybe other uh, countries more aligned with Russia and North Korea. But I also want to draw a parallel with another country that also sent a lot of soldiers in return for a lot of economic aid, and that was South Korea back in 1965 through 72, where it rotated 2 combat divisions, some 330,000 soldiers. And what impact did that have for South Korea? And what can we infer some of those lessons for North Korea? I mean, throughout the 80s and 90s, I think practically all South Korean general grade officers had combat experience in Vietnam. In return for sending troops, South Korean government under Park Chung-hee had received a lot of military aid as well as economic aid, and that kind of, in a way, catapulted Korea's 70s industrialization. Would this happen for North Korea? Not at the level, but certainly I think the hard currency that it's going to receive. Certainly, I think the military will learn its lessons as a very tough lesson for North Koreans, but they're beginning to adapt, as we are told by Ukrainian intelligence. And I think the fear that North Korea may have in sending its citizens abroad and coming back with foreign ideas is less of a threat now to the North Korean regime. North Korea has had over 2 decades of sending a lot of labor force out, and they have a system domestically to deal with those who come back, whether they are sent into re-education camps, more monitoring. It doesn't seem to lead to kind of perhaps the Arab Spring potential with sending out people and for them to experience, see new ideas. What does this mean for the United States, South Korea, and Japan? I think we are losing the battle to stop North Korea from threatening the United States with nuclear weapons. We've already lost the battle to prevent North Korea from developing nuclear weapons. When North Korea perfects the miniaturization of its nuclear warheads and perfects its ballistic missile program, North Korea may become an existential threat to the United States. That is, North Korea to have the capability to deliver nuclear weapons against the United States may be seen as a severe, clear, and present danger. I recall almost a couple of decades ago having lunch with a former USFK, U.S. Forces commander, in which he explained to me quite simply, you have this ballistic missile, you miniaturize it, you have the ability to strike the United States, and then he very sternly said, that's when we go to war. What can the U.S. do to prevent North Korea from perfecting its missile program? How can the U.S. deter North Korea? And would deterring North Korea be the same similarly as we can deter Russia and China? I would say most likely yes. But how can we deter North Korea from behaving aggressively, belligerently against South Korea or Japan? And that I'm not so sure. The main question for us, I think, is how can extended deterrence provided to South Korea and Japan be credible if, and this is a big if the US begins to entertain the idea that North Korea can keep some of its nuclear weapons in return for the cessation of its ballistic missile program. Is this scenario far-fetched? I mean, if President Trump reaches out to Kim Jong-un, has another round of meetings, and President Trump claims to make America safe again by cutting a deal with North Korea in which it gives up its ballistic missile program, therefore it doesn't threaten the US, in return for some kind of a commitment to not threaten South Korea and Japan. Would he, would he take the deal? For South Korea and Japan, at least for South Korea, North Korea having ICBMs to carry nuclear warheads may only marginally impact South Korea and security, since the distance from Pyongyang to Busan at the southernmost tip is only about 333 miles. So the main security threat for South Korea lies in the erosion of US extended deterrence. And if the current and future US administrations put less importance on our alliances, how can we convey to South Korea and Japan that in worst case scenarios, that we would trade Seoul or Tokyo for LA or New York? And just as NATO members have questioned American resolve in the past and present, Seoul and Tokyo may begin to question American resolve in Asia. And so is the unthinkable of South Korea or Japan fighting against a Russia, North Korea, China axis without US involvement would be a real nightmare. And any erosion of US extended deterrence would surely invite calls in South Korea and Japan to go nuclear. And so going back to this notion of kind of misperception of Russia and North Korea that Nick mentioned earlier, I think it's dangerous because it seems like, having covered North Korea for the past 3 decades, our intelligence estimate is consistently wrong about North Korea's capability and ability to do some really fascinating things. Just as an anecdotal story, I had a chance to go to North Korea back in 2013 with a group of American magicians. You heard it right, magicians. And yes, aside from the joke that, hey, can we make the North Korean nuclear weapons disappear? We spent a week in North Korea watching and attending some of these festivals where many countries came. And I asked the leading American magician who organized this, what does North Koreans' magic look like? And he says, it's a little clumsy. They don't have the ability to go abroad and learn new techniques, so they develop their own. And it's a little clumsy, but the outcome is still pretty spectacular. And I think that's what we have to work with North Korea, is that we always underestimate their, their prowess, their economic standard, and yet, we stand amazed when they detonate another nuclear device or send a missile over. It might not be perfect, but they are determined to perfect it. Let me end there and open for any questions that the audience may.
Great. Thank you very much, Jay. Thank you also to you, Nick. So we'll open for questions now. Those who would like to submit a question, please use that Q&A tab down at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you can type in your questions there. We have already one question actually from Paul Hare to the two of you. So is Beijing comfortable with the North Korea-Russia relationship? Do leaders in Beijing think that North Korea, Pyongyang, should have sent the troops to fight alongside the Russians in Ukraine. Does this sort of growing Russia-North Korea relationship and maybe China looking a little bit askance at that, does it undermine the idea that there's like a China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis of some kind? So what do the Chinese think about all of this, and what implications does it have for this China, Russia, Iran, North Korea idea?
Well, if I can start, Paul, with that larger philosophical point first, I think that one of the issues is that we are always so quick in Washington to want to create axes and alliances. And it was convenient to say, well, Russia and China and Iran and North Korea are now a new axis because it replaces the axis of evil, which replaces the original axis. These are entente relationships, and it's a word that's fallen out of favor in Washington, but these are ententes. These are relationships where countries have interests that align. They work together on those interests, but they also have interests that diverge, and they don't try to necessarily harmonize everything or to try to say everything that you do, we must do or approve. I think we certainly saw this in the case of Russia and Iran. Iran did not want to make the commitments that North Korea was willing to make in its security agreement with Russia. And then in turn, the Russians said, after the recent strikes, you didn't want a closer security relationship, and it's really not in our interests to confront Israel or the United States. So I think if we think of these relationships as entente relationships, associations, it helps to provide some clarity. One of the things is that I think, and Jay, I'm interested in your thoughts on this as well. I think that there's two minds in Beijing. On the one hand, right, obviously, North Korea and Russia working directly clearly is an effort to also for both Moscow and Pyongyang to balance their relationships with Beijing. And to the extent that it lessens Chinese influence or lessens China's ability to set agendas, they're going to be concerned. On the other hand, I think China also looks at this and says, great, North Korea is a wonderful proxy. They can do things and we can keep our hands clean. We can supply the components for Russian factories and North Korean factories. We can provide technical assistance. But then when the United States complains, we can say, well, no Chinese in Russia. We're not involved, right? That's been a consistent Chinese statement, both to the US, but also to the Europeans. We're not involved. We are not present. That's the North Koreans. And so I think that it's a mixed picture. I think that there are some in China that are concerned that Russia and North Korea can go off the reservation in ways that impact Chinese interests. On the other hand, it's useful for China to have North Korea doing these things. And to the extent that it was accurately reported or not, that senior Chinese officials told their European counterparts that it's not in China's interest for Russia to be decisively defeated in Ukraine, then North Korea, which is already under sanction, is a perfect proxy. And then finally, a last thing that I think with, as you raised China, North Korea, Iran, is the extent to which, and Jay's point about, South Korea, the Republic of Korea's experience in Vietnam, right? This is the first major combat experience that the North Koreans have had. Chinese observers are getting up close and personal with what's happening. Dara Masako has been really charting some of these interrelationships. Systems are tested. You see what works. More importantly, you see the extent to which NATO advisors working with the Ukrainians adapt and what it says about Western technology and Western adaptability. So, if we think also, unfortunately, because, Russians and Ukrainians are being killed, but that this is really the laboratory for mid-21st century warfare. And of course, China wants to benefit and learn from what's going on there for any lessons which are applicable in a possible future clash with the United States?
For China, I think they're much more pragmatic and long-term thinking and also confident in their relations with North Korea. Recently, they celebrated the 64th anniversary of their treaty, and I've read a recent article in which the Chinese delegation was a more senior delegation as opposed to last year. So China is now wanting to improve its relations with North Korea after some not a disastrous, but I think during the North Korea Trump discussions, certainly I think North Korea felt slighted or cornered by China, and I think maybe perhaps feelings were bruised. But for the Chinese strategic calculus, Korean Peninsula is important. And it's not so much North Korea, but what happens in the Korean Peninsula in general. I mean, if you go back 100 years, 130 years ago, it was the war over the Korean Peninsula between China and Japan that created Taiwan. And if we think China's most pressing foreign policy concern is unification with Taiwan, what happened on the Korean Peninsula matters. And therefore, if we kind of play this out, if North Korea's behavior goes to a point where it involves the U.S. on the Korean Peninsula that may be antagonistic towards China or is seen by China. I mean, if you recall the placement of THAAD missile defense under Park Geun-hye administration, and the kind of frigid relationship that lasted for several years with South Korea, if North Korea's behavior leads to more involvement on the Korean Peninsula by the U.S. forces, and or South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons, and I'm working on some thought on South Korea asking for the reintroduction of tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, all those things impact China, and I think China is cautious. But I think this view that somehow China shares our view in North Korea's denuclearization, that our China hands have been saying for 2 decades, is simply wrong. I don't think, and like Russia, I don't think China, it's a priority, but is it in the top 3 priorities for China? I don't think so. I mean, I think both China and Russia want a stable proxy. It's not the severe competition that we had between Sino-Soviet split in the Cold War. I think there's less ability for North Korea to maneuver like that. And North Korea, I think under this leader, doesn't know history and for him, it's ski resorts and beach resorts and getting economic assistance. And in a way, I mean, making North Korea more safe for him, and then for it to trickle down to its citizens. And so to me, the China angle is the kind of wait and see, but I think they're not threatened by this, North Korea deepening relations with Russia.
Thanks very much, Jay. We have some additional questions from our audience. I certainly encourage anyone else who might have a question to put it into the Q&A tab there. And I would encourage each of you, as we sort of get closer to 11 o'clock here, to try to give kind of short answers so that we can get to as many of the questions as possible. This first one, Jay, I think is really just for you. From Eric Sharayev. How is South Korea responding to Moscow's overtures toward Pyongyang? sort of deeper strategic calculations might shape the South Korean response to all of this. And, you know, certainly we've seen already, as you know, Jay, just to tack on there, you know, South Korean arms sales to Poland, you know, for example, just to point to one thing. So how is South Korea responding to all this?
So let me backtrack and talk a little bit about the last administration, Yoon's administration. The Yoon's administration was very much in support of the fighting in Ukraine, providing arms, providing sale of arms. And then once President Trump was elected, they shifted focus. The ministry shifted focus about getting, you know, reconstruction projects in Ukraine because they calculated that maybe President Trump will be able to end the war. And then there's boon to be had in reconstruction. And then came this administration, Jae-myung Lee's Progressive Democratic Party government. And right now it's too early to tell, but what they want to do is to improve inter-Korean relations. And so, you know, first thing they did was they brought in the old unification minister because the current government doesn't have a whole lot of connections to North Korea. It's been a long time for them to have had the kind of relationship, and North Korea reciprocated by cutting off everything that previous Democratic Party governments have built. And so they're trying to build from scratch an inter-Korean relations, and South Korea has given positive approvals for religious NGOs to reach out to North Korea to provide assistance. The South Korean government now is desperately trying to build bridges with North Korea, but also bridge to this administration. Right now, they're so focused on the tariff negotiation, the economic relationship. And that's why the current government has yet to, for example, take the overture from China. The Chinese government has invited the president to attend their victory parade, I think September, I forget, 7th, 8th, or 9th. And the Korean president hasn't, as far as I know, hasn't replied because what he wants to signal to Washington is that the U.S.-Korea relationship is a priority for him. And so in that sense, I think right now South Korea will take a back seat, improve its relationship with the United States, but at the same time find ways to build connections with North Korea. Will North Korea reciprocate? And to me, marginally, I think North Korea has said, as Nick alluded earlier, the relationship isn't so much with South Korea, Japan, the United States, that their future really lies with, I think, better relationship with Russia, more economic relationship with Russia and China.
Thanks very much, Jay. So I think Nick will give you the next two here, actually, and again, I kind of encourage you to try to be brief if you can. There's one from Marcus Noland saying, you know, historically the Soviet Union had concerns about proliferation. It didn't permit its satellite states to develop nuclear capabilities. Has Putin's Russia abandoned that approach?
Yeah, oh, I mean, first of all, I mean, Russia doesn't have satellites the way that the Soviet Union did. But, you know, officially, you know, Russia remained post-Soviet Russia, the Russian Federation is committed to non-proliferation, to the treaty. Nuclear weapons shouldn't spread. But in reality, my sense is that, again, as Russia embraces what it sees as best in its interest, which is a G0 world, not a G2 or G7 or G8 running things. It accepts that nuclear weapons are the one deterrent that works against the United States. And that even having the pieces of a program, as Iran demonstrated, even if you're sort of saying, well, we're close to, but not crossing the line, that doesn't give you enough of a deterrent capability. And that the Russian view, at least as I'm interpreting it, and again, this is not an official view. You're not going to get this if you went to the foreign ministry. But the sense is that the current states that are seeking to become nuclear states are becoming nuclear states because of the United States. They seek to restrain and deter the United States, which is in Russia's interests. And if at some point they become hostile to Russian interests, Russia has already learned to live with multiple nuclear states surrounding it. And so they'll cross that bridge when they get to it. So I think that there, as we've seen with Iran, with North Korea, Russia really doesn't feel a need to enforce sanctions on them for their nuclear programs or their missile programs, and in fact is aiding them in a variety of ways. So I think Russia has embraced, or has, I shouldn't say embraced, has accepted the reality that nuclear proliferation is going to happen, that it's not in Russia's interest to try to stop it, particularly because the Russian view on this now is that helping the United States stop nuclear proliferation elsewhere just moves Russia up on the agenda for the United States to deal with at the end of the day.
Thank you for that, Nick. And if I were to throw in my own very short observation on that point, and I'll keep it very brief. Russia is in a situation in which North Korea actually already has nuclear weapons, and it already has missiles that can reach Russia. So the question for Russian policymakers in thinking about North Korea is not whether or not they can prevent North Korea from having nuclear weapons or whether they can prevent them from having missiles that can reach Russia. It's whether or not they can and should prevent them from having missiles that can reach the United States.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a different policy question. Nick, we got another question for you here from Sabina Lum from National Defense Magazine. She's kind of following up on your point earlier about exquisite military systems versus maybe cheaper things that get the job done. And this is getting away a little bit from our Russia North Korea topic, but do you feel that the United States has put too much emphasis on these very advanced or complex systems, autonomous technology, et cetera, in assessing threats?
Yeah, I think very much so. And this idea that you have this very complicated, very exquisite system that, yes, can deliver a lot of capability, but the quantity aspect, we really have neglected that over the years. And what we have seen over 3 years now of fighting in Ukraine is that quantity matters, and that simplifying things so that they can be quickly replicated and adapted. So this actually does tie back to Iran and North Korea as well, right? Which is that, these initial Shahed drones that Iran has provided, how they have transformed over the last 3 years, improvements, tweaks, other things that are done, and then how quickly that feeds back into the manufacture. Because one of the things that I think we have this sort of contemptuous approach towards the supposed technological backwardness of our adversaries. And yet what they're demonstrating is their feedback loop for improvement is much quicker than ours. And that Russia, with North Korean and Iranian assistance and that cooperation with China behind it, is adapting and then producing in mass quantities. And so that the drones that we're seeing that are being used, for example, in Ukraine today are several generations ahead of what was being there in 2022. And the feedback loop back to the manufacturers to say, tweak, do this, get this order up and running, is something that we ought to be studying. we ought to be paying, and part of the problem, I think, as Jay has pointed out, is our lack of knowledge, our lack of focus on some of these things. But again, when we're talking about, sending a handful of patriots, because that's all that's left in the arsenal, as opposed to, basically the Russians have hit their target, which is, they can field 1,000 drones, a night in these assaults. Now they're reaching those levels, and they're able to produce. And again, this comes back to, the topic of our webinar today is, we can say, well, North Korean labor isn't as skilled or isn't as advanced, but those North Korean labor battalions that are filling out the third shifts in Russian industry are giving Russia what even now, again, we had NATO Secretary General Rutte here in Washington admitting that, what Russia, it takes NATO more than a year to match what Russia can produce now in a month. And North Korea, this North Korea relationship is an important yet unsung part of that Russian ability to quickly produce at mass. And we better be learning from this, or we're going to be, unpleasantly surprised in the next conflict.
Thanks very much, Nick. So let me
Paul.
Sorry, Jay, just very briefly, I want to ask each of you a final question. So very brief if you can.
Just regarding what Nick just said about our inability to mass produce things quickly. Drones. I mean, North Korea has now opened up a factory with Russian technology and to build drones. Our ability to build drones is really difficult, largely because we have these kind of small startup companies that have great technology, but the motors and the gears that go into them are all made in China, and we're not able to outsource the development or in China. So it's, even if we have really great startup companies that can mass produce, we just don't have the supply chain capability to produce them efficiently and economically.
Thanks a lot, Jay, for that observation. So it's 10:55. We got 5 minutes. Let me just ask you each a final question, please, very brief. So we touched on, Nick, I think you touched on the question of sanctions and Russia kind of no longer observing the sanctions. Russia obviously has a short border with North Korea. So in practice, kind of anybody who wanted to trade with North Korea, government, company, or otherwise, can kind of do that through Russia, especially if they have a way to do it without using US dollars or touching on the Western banking system. So are we in effect here seeing the end of North Korea's international isolation? And if so, what consequences may that have? 2 minutes each, very short.
Yes, Paul, and put another way, it's that there's now enough countries that have been isolated by the United States to some extent that they're now working with each other. So that it's not that North Korea is less isolated, it's that Russia, having been isolated, now has an interest in bringing together the axis of the isolated. So sorry, I used the axis word there. But to the extent then that Russia's own ability to access world markets remains open through a number of third-party countries, yes, then the impact of that is to essentially give North Korea that trade lifeline, not only to Russia, but then to the other countries that are dealing with Russia. And just briefly on what you mentioned about the border area is, we are now seeing the development of these kind of border transitional zones. And I'm thinking of the Georgia-Russia border, which is a similar sanction zone where a lot of goods that are ostensibly sanctioned to Russia from Europe all get sent to Georgia or to Armenia and Georgia, and then you have that border zone where they cross over. That's how Land Rover still keeps selling cars in Russia. And so I think, now we're going to see more of this, where North Korea now is linked into this Russian network of third-party roundabouts in a way that North Korea 10 years ago did not have access to that. And even for China, right? China can say we're upholding sanctions because they can send things to these to the Russia-North Korea zone and then have it cross there. And then that last point, then over to Jay, the extent to which now we have enough non-dollar instruments, other currencies, stable coins, which enable trade to take place that does not need to go through the dollar infrastructure. And again, something that wasn't there 10 years ago is there now, and North Korea will benefit.
Thanks very much, Nick. Jay, you get the last word
I would
here.
also say that we really overestimate our ability to isolate North Korea. I think at the height of sanctions, etc., we know that things were going through China, Russian border, on the seas. Whenever the border closed, it's not because the Chinese or the Russians closed it. It was done internally by the North Koreans. And I think they have, in a way, developed a myriad ways to trade. And we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. And as Nick says now, I agree. I think they're much more capable of doing business globally.
Thanks very much, Jay. Thank you also to you, Nick, for joining us. I think a really terrific conversation. And finally, thanks, of course, to our audience, without whom none of this would be possible. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Have a terrific day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.